A lot of people contributed to Zoom Tool. We have some questions for you to think about if you want to ask about stories at the end. Obviously, we can't cover very much of Marc Pelletier's life, and it's colored by our own experience. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel Erday, who was a collaborator with Marc and Amina, he lit a spidering candle for Marc. I'm going to try to go through my experience of Marc. Well, we were working together, and we were very close friends. And I sort of passed him off on Amina after a while because he tends to tire people out. But when I say explorer, artist, and teacher on this, I'm talking about Marc, certainly, but also I have to mention Steve Baer and Clark Rickert before I talk about Marc very much, so we'll get started with that. Steve Baer is the one that well, I won't say anything. Who knows Steve Baer? Who's heard of Steve Baer? Show of hands. What would you say? 15 people, maybe? Okay, how many people in this room have done work or that's been informed, say, by the Zoom tool? Okay, a few more. Well, when you think of the Zoom tool, think of Steve Baer. We can talk more about that later. Clark Rickert, an artist, he was my mentor, and I'm very grateful for him because if I didn't know Clark, I never would have met Marc. This is how Baer met Rickert. Rickert had gotten some money for a painting that he made, and there's a good story about that. And he decided that rather than just dropping art, which is what he did when he was at the Kansas City Art Institute, he and his friends decided you have to live in your art. So they bought 7 acres of land near Trinidad, Colorado, and started building a city, Drop City. And Clark was the only resident the first year, and then Steve Baer showed up. And he starts climbing up this dome that's been made out of scraps from the sawmill, and Clark says, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." And Steve is, "No, these things are really strong." And then he looks at the butt joint in the middle that's sort of halfway nailed together and sort of backs down like a cat from a tree. So that's how Clark met Steve. Now, they built a house. This is the house that Clark lived in. It's probably the first zonahedral structure of recent years, made out of car tops. There was an argument of how much it cost. Clark said $8. His friend said, "No, Clark, it was $12. You forgot the screws." Okay, so we move ahead. Steve Baer starts ZoneWorks. He discovered the 31 zone system amidst all this, and that's a whole other story. But Clark used the 31 zone system to discover Penrose tiles and design the ZoneWorks bus. That's the cool thing about Zoom Tool. You get to discover stuff, and it feels just as good, right? Even if you discovered a dodecahedron for the first time, it's just as good as Plato felt, or whomever. So this is Clark's painting, The True Story of the Quasi-Crystal. We can talk more about that. But in a way, he scooped Penrose. And if you look closely at the painting, you can actually see the Scientific American in the shelf. I don't know where, okay, anyway, I can't point at it, but in the shelf. So Baer develops the Zoom toy, and he gets a rich investor. Dennis Hopper pays for some artwork from Clark. Marc sees it when his school library burns down, and he has to go to the public library. And he realizes that Coxeter can be reproduced by the Zoom toy. So he's 3 weeks from graduating and hitchhikes out to New Mexico and occupies Baer, and it's kind of been that way for the rest of his life. Baer passed him off to Glenn Smith, who gave him to David Booth, who sent him to Clark Rickert, who turned him over to me, and then I turned him over to Amina. And it was worth it. Clark, about 3 weeks after Marc and I met in Clark's studio, Marc discovered his periodic table. Clark had been working on a periodic table. It was, what if you mix together all of the chemical elements, and what would they crystallize out? And that would be the Philosopher's Stone, which essentially is the periodic table. And Marc came up with one, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner. And he figured it out on this interesting idea that if you add up odd numbers, you get squares, and if you multiply the squares by 2, you get SPDF, shell structures. It's pretty cool. And he turned it into baby's blocks, into a little child's manipulative. Pretty amazing discovery. And this tells you a lot about Marc, too, because the most important thing I learned from him is structure of number is structure of space. If you think about this conference, you realize that's a lot of people here talking about that. Marc and I got permission to make the Zome toy, so Marc hitchhiked out to Minneapolis to try to pick up the mold. He was a little disappointed when he found out it wasn't quite that big, but I'm sure it looked that big because he thought it was the size of the ball. You could just stick it in your pocket and hitchhike home. We started making the parts. We thought about selling them as kits, but we really sold them to quasi-crystals. In the meantime, I was trying to figure out a better way to color code it because I was too dumb to use it. I was stuck the wrong stick in the wrong hole. So I was sitting around one night and did that, and Marc looked at it, and out popped that.
He did get a picture of it.
He designed the Zome tool using the Zome toy in his brain. That's Marc Pelletier. Oh, we did get a patent. That was before he realized it's just a way of sharing your intellectual property with everybody in the world. Fortunately, if they'd followed the design we came up with, we didn't know how we were going to make the damn thing. And so we had this mold that wouldn't work. So if you want to spend a lot of money on a failure, like me, I guess, try to copy the mold from the patent. And then came quasi-crystals. How am I doing on time?
More than halfway done.
Yeah, okay, well, we're getting there. And we also wanted to take questions. That's why we gave you some suggestions at first, because there are good stories in there. But you can see the Zome primer and the X-ray crystallography pattern. You can see the Zomes that Baer is building before Frank Gale took these photographs at NBS or wherever it was. Here's Daniel Shechtman using a model that Marc built to help him figure out the structure of quasi-crystals. So here's at least one Nobel Prize winner whose work was informed by Steve Baer's 31 zone system. Don't forget the name. It's only one syllable. Baer. Marc and I thought we'd make some money by doing a quasi-crystal toy for this professor. I guess he's now the Einstein Chair at Princeton. You might know him. Marc and I didn't think a whole lot of him. We did this toy for him, and then he, you notice the artwork that's in the Princeton Sculpture Garden? Marc made a hyperdoe for Conway, and then we're walking around the garden, we're like, what's that? You know, I couldn't believe, I was just shocked, because the artist is Paul Steinhardt. So after we did that project, we had to design the ball mold, and Marc said, road trip, because we didn't really want to work. We did have a little bit of money that people had invested. So we saw Coxeter. The quasi-crystal incident happened during the road trip. If you want to ask about that, I can probably reveal it for the first time. Computer graphics were expensive. We actually eventually got a program for doing hidden line removal from NASA. It was called Sketch, and it was pretty sketchy. So the first night, what does Marc want to do? He wants to do a hyperdoe, on the computer. Steve Rogers wrote the program. Scott Vortman, who is here, wrote the real program, VZome, so check with him. But anyway, we had to do this by hand on cell vinyls. And when we did the hyperdoe, we crashed the university's VAX 11780. It's typical Marc, over the top. Steve Rogers came up with a way to make the balls out of friendly plastic. We made a model. Baer loved it, looked at it for 5 minutes. He couldn't talk. We made a mold. We made parts. And, just like it takes a Viking to raise a village, it takes a village to build a ball mold. And we're thankful for all these people, everybody. And if you don't see your picture in there, you should be in there. Let me know. It's art. Keeps changing.
You got about a minute on your time. Paul.
Good.
Well,
So we have 2 minutes for
questions.
questions.
Questions. Go to your question screen.
What's that?
Didn't you have that wonderful question screen?
That was supposed to be after the whole thing.
Okay,
Because
well,
some of the
fine
questions
then.
have to
All
do
right,
with you.
good. Okay.
Okay. How do I turn this off?
Well, no, you're talking. Okay. So I met Marc Pelletier in 1999 at an NCTM conference. At that time, there weren't a lot of venues for math, art educators who made products to get together, except for supplying teachers for the classroom. So we met on the steps in San Francisco, and this was the product that Marc was selling, which was, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Fractile 7, but it's a magnetic tiling toy that deals with the symmetry of 7 and 14 and its geometry. So here's the fold out of it. And also a board with the magnetic tiles. So he solved it with just 3 simple tiles and primary numbers. Notice his own tool colors on there. He met me when I was carrying this sign, and I was making my own magnetic 8-fold symmetrical manipulatives for the classroom. So he was working on symmetry 7, I was working on symmetry 8, and we didn't see each other again until after the show. And I was working with an autistic young man who was building polyhedra, so I was just trying to collect material for him. And Marc had this polyhedron he discovered, and it actually will make a polyhedron. And when I handed it to the autistic kid, he knew what it would make. It doesn't have a name. I'm sorry I couldn't find a picture of the object itself. I mean, I have the object somewhere. But when somebody passes away and you have 20 years worth of stuff to look through, it's kind of hard to find what you're looking for sometimes. But anyway, the autistic kid, when I handed him this piece, he knew that it had a triconahedron on the inside. So Marc was pretty impressed by that. We were all, like I said, we were working on similar problems. I was also working on a solution for the elemental table and was really annoyed when I found out that he'd found one. Actually, you should look at it more closely, puzzle people, because there are some not only shell structures to be found, but you'll notice that like all the metals are on one level, and there's just all kinds of interesting ways to look at chemistry and memorize it by using Marc's elemental table. So I went out to Colorado, which was where Boulder was, to work with Jay Bonner. And this is Jay Bonner, Michael Baer, and Marc. We were working with them on some Islamic patterns in architecture design. And Marc was toting Zomes, which this was putting patterns onto Zome. Okay, so this kind of jumps here, so forgive me. So when we got together, we made all kinds of products. This is an example of the Islamic Geometric Kit that we made, and the instructions with ways to tile them and whatnot. And it's so basically each polygon has patterns on it. Oh, and I forgot, gosh, that's something I put in this lecture, were pictures of those. And we also worked on, like I said, various ways of mass producing and tiling products. This here is a polar zonahedron, which was a product which was 7-fold, and this is all one cut, actually, which is, to me, like my proudest moment, because when you run a tool, it'll pick up and drop, and if you go with automatic settings, it'll either cut out polygons and usually go all over the place. It's not nearly as efficient as they say. So I learned how to program with a series of clicks where the tool drops and lifts. In this case, it goes to the center, and then it goes out. So if you follow a line, it's just basically making loops with these going along the polar zonahedra. So in one cut, you cut over 90 pieces by the time the knife lifts. And then the product is on the right, just so you get a look at that. And as Paul was telling you that Marc was very much into higher dimensions. He made a 120 cell, which was dedicated to the Fields Institute. And so we went up there and had basically a math camp out with John Conway and Donald Coxeter and several other people. And this was at a dedication at the Fields Institute where Marc talked about the model builder Paul Donchin, which did the models in Coxeter's polytopes book, regular polytopes. And this led us on all kinds of adventures. We got to go out to dinner with the director of the Fields Institute to a very snooty restaurant where John Conway leans over and asks Marc to take off his shoelaces. And the director ties me up in ties as I'm looking at what John Conway is doing, tying up Mark. So I was trying to put my leg over the director's head, and anyway, it was like gymnastics in a very uppity place, and we had a great time. So that didn't make it in Siobhan's book. I wish it did, because she missed the best part of that journey there. When Mark passed away, Koji Miyazaki, who's written several excellent polytopes book in Japanese, and Mark has them. They're beautiful, and he loved pictures, so it's all Japanese, but you see the polytopes, and it's really well done. So you can look up Koji's books, but he sent out with a Japanese emissary this four-dimensional picture of Mark. Okay, so another math adventure would be when we go to the Bridges conferences since 2000s and early 2000. And we ran into Daniel Erde from Hungary. It was his first Bridges coming, and we from Hungary to Banff, Canada. And Reza Sarhangi, who was the founder of that conference, leaned over and said, "This poor man has lost his bags. Can you please take care of him for me?" And Daniel basically said, "We'll trade for underwear." So that's how we met, and he brought several 3D imprints over from Hungary, and we noticed that he didn't have any odd-numbered polyhedra in his collection, or odd-numbered vertices polyhedrons, such as the pentagon or icosahedron, when we met him. And so when we got back from the conference, we each would kind of, peruse and then come back and have a meeting about it, and I said, "Well, Mark, did you notice he didn't have any odd-numbered?" And he said, "Yes, he did." And so I said, "Well, how do you make an odd number even is to double the edge, so how about we solve it using a peri-solid?" And he said that would work. And so then Mark and Walt van Bollehoyen of Holland put together not only the splatonics, as we call them, spidron platonic solids, which you see right to the right there of the Science News. And then it also solved all the Archimedeans, which you see at the bottom of that frame. And thanks to our lecture here at G4G, we did a presentation on this and the linkages that we found down 2 minutes. Are you kidding me? Okay, so we did some linkages, which are also really cool, and now I gotta go really quick. We had to design a toolbit just to make this sculpture, which is a spidronized tetra. This is the mold that we made for the dodeca linkage, and there's a story behind that, but I have no time for that now. There's the linkage itself, don't know if we had time for that. Those are some spidronized magnets that we made, tiled the plane. This is a binary system that Mark was working, or that we made, but he'd been working on with Jean-Marc Castera sometime earlier before we met. Here's a spidronized circle limit. We were also very much into zomes, and he could make whole towns and structures with courtyards and things, and they link together in various ways. These are the very beginnings of him trying to show the concept. Here's some with patterns on them, and he also had a way of connecting the roof to the floor in terms, let's see if we have time for that. This is called the Mogul Technique, and it explains how we can make zones and put them together. And I'm just going to click through here. Here we are in Morocco, in Casablanca on a conference for the traditional arts in Morocco. And then Mark went into a whole new line of the fractal, like he'd do things in layers just like he did with the binary system, and would, in a Moroccan style, and he gets even more and more complicated, up to 3 levels before he passed away. And there's his own tool colors again. Here's some grill work that he made shortly before he passed. And as I'm taking pictures, we're out of, okay, you see I have a bulldog. I'm taking pictures of these hand models, and notice Volo. Here's Mark with Max Penrose, Roger Penrose's son, making bubbles and teaching him about that. There we are having fun with the family at San Francisco when Tom Banshoff was there. This is Mark's last sculpture. This is a space frame system which you saw built yesterday using the Tricon node. Oh, you only used one picture, Paul? Oh, well, okay. Anyway, and this was the last zone tool that he made. It's a 6D cube. And when I was going through various things, this is, he wrote on about anything, and this was on an envelope. So hopefully, you know, we'll keep going with his work, because he made all kinds of kits and things ready for me. So hopefully, what he gave to the world also is his own ball, and that will be in your gift bag. And I don't know if I have time. Do we out of time?